Hey everyone, welcome back to True Crime for Sleep Stories. Every night we explore true stories that remind us how close darkness can sometimes sit beside the ordinary. These are quiet retellings, no jump scares, no noise, just real events, told softly so you can listen, think, or drift off as you like. So find a comfortable spot, maybe dim the lights. And if you've been enjoying these calm, true crime nights, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does help. Now, let's take a deep breath and begin tonight's case. My name is James Patterson, and I was a special agent with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Police for 31 years, from 1968 to 1999. In that time, I investigated every kind of crime that could happen on or near railroad property: thefts of cargo, vandalism, trespassers struck by trains, occasional assaults. But in October 1973, I investigated a homicide that has stayed with me for 51 years, a case that was never solved and left a young man buried without a name. The B&O Railroad, officially the Baltimore and Ohio, one of the oldest railroads in America, ran through Cumberland, Maryland, a historic railroad town in the western part of the state. In 1973, Cumberland was still a significant railroad hub, though the industry was declining from its heyday. The yards and tracks were busy with freight traffic, and the area attracted transients, people who rode the rails looking for work or just traveling, a tradition that went back generations. On October 18, 1973, a Thursday afternoon around 2:30 p.m., two railroad maintenance workers, Bill Reynolds and Tom Chen, were inspecting signal equipment along the main line about 3 miles east of the Cumberland station. They were checking relay boxes, the metal cabinets that housed electrical equipment controlling signals along the track. One particular relay box, designated as Box 47, was located in a somewhat isolated spot beside the tracks, surrounded by brush and small trees. It was an older unit that had been decommissioned months earlier. The equipment inside had been removed and the box was scheduled for eventual removal, but that hadn't happened yet. The door should have been secured, but when Bill and Tom approached it that afternoon, they noticed the padlock was missing and the door was slightly ajar. Bill opened the door wider to check if vandals had been inside or if copper wiring had been stolen, a common problem with unused equipment. That's when he saw the body. A young man was crammed inside the signal box, which was only about 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and 5 feet tall, barely large enough to fit a person. The body was positioned sitting with legs bent, head slumped forward. The man was clearly deceased and had been for some time. Bill immediately backed away and radioed the railroad dispatcher, who contacted local authorities and me. I was working out of the Cumberland office that day and arrived at the scene around 3:15 p.m., along with the Allegheny County Sheriff's Department and the Maryland State Police. The scene was grim. The young man appeared to be in his early to mid-20s, wearing jeans and a gray sweatshirt, no jacket despite the October weather. His shoes were missing, just socks on his feet. His pockets had been turned inside out, suggesting robbery. There was significant trauma to his face and head. He'd been beaten severely before being placed in the signal box. The medical examiner, Dr. Helen Morrison, arrived around 4 p.m. and made preliminary observations before the body was removed. She noted the victim had been dead for approximately 3 to 5 days based on decomposition and the cool October temperatures. The cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head, likely from being beaten with a heavy object, possibly a pipe or bat or large rock. There was no identification on the body. His pockets were completely empty. No wallet, no papers, no coins, nothing. The only item found nearby that might have belonged to him was a denim jacket, discovered about 20 feet from the signal box, partially hidden under brush. In one pocket of the jacket was a book of matches from a bar called the Iron Horse Tavern in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, about 90 miles northeast of Cumberland. The victim's fingerprints were taken and sent to the FBI. No matches came back. He'd never been arrested, never been fingerprinted for military service or employment, never had any official interaction that would have put his prints in a database. His dental records were documented and circulated to dentists throughout Maryland and surrounding states, but no matches came back. Without identification, we created a physical description for distribution. White male, approximately 25 years old, 5'9" inches tall, approximately 160 pounds, shoulder-length brown hair, brown eyes, no visible tattoos or distinctive scars beyond facial injuries from the beating. He wore size 10 shoes based on his sock size and a size medium sweatshirt. Missing persons reports from Maryland, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Virginia were reviewed. Several young men matching the general description had been reported missing in recent months, but when we investigated further, comparing dental records, contacting families for additional details, none matched our victim. The investigation focused on determining who the victim was and what had happened to him. The signal box location was significant. It was isolated, not visible from the road, accessible only by walking along the railroad tracks or through the woods. Whoever killed him and hid his body there knew the area and knew about the decommissioned signal box. The fact that he'd been beaten, robbed, and had his shoes taken suggested this might have been a crime of opportunity, someone attacking a vulnerable person for whatever money or valuables he had. Transients riding the rails were sometimes targeted by other transients or by locals who preyed on vulnerable people passing through. We interviewed railroad employees who worked the Cumberland area, asking if they'd seen any unfamiliar people around the tracks in the days before October 18th. Several workers mentioned that transients were common. People would hop freight trains, ride for a while, jump off in Cumberland to rest or look for day labor, then hop another train heading east or west. One worker, a brakeman named Eddie Torres, recalled seeing a young man matching the victim's description near the Cumberland yards around October 12th or 13th, about a week before the body was discovered. Eddie remembered him because the guy had been sitting on a pile of railroad ties, eating from a can of beans, wearing a denim jacket. Eddie had told him to move along, that he couldn't loiter in the rail yard, and the guy had walked off without argument. That sighting, if it was our victim, suggested he'd been in Cumberland for several days before his death. We also interviewed locals in the area near where the signal box was located. A woman named Martha Sullivan, who lived in a house about a quarter mile from the tracks, mentioned she'd seen a man walking along the railroad right-of-way on October 14th, a Sunday afternoon. She'd been in her backyard and had noticed him because people occasionally walked the tracks despite the trespassing laws, but usually not alone. She described him as young, wearing jeans and a denim jacket, carrying a small pack or bag. She couldn't see his face clearly from that distance, The matchbook from the Iron Horse Tavern in Johnstown became a lead we pursued. I drove to Johnstown and interviewed the owner and staff at the bar. It was a working-class establishment near the old steel mills, the kind of place where railroad workers and laborers gathered. The owners said they went through hundreds of matchbooks. They were free advertising. People took them all the time. He couldn't remember anyone matching the victim's description specifically, but said young guys passing through town would sometimes come in for a beer. I showed the victim's photograph, taken post-mortem but composed to look as natural as possible, at businesses around Johnstown, asking if anyone recognized him. A few people thought he looked vaguely familiar, but nobody could provide a name or concrete information. The investigation hit dead ends repeatedly. We had a victim with no identity, no witnesses to the actual crime, no clear suspects, and limited physical evidence. The beating that killed him had been brutal, multiple blows to the head and face, suggesting either rage or a prolonged attack. The killer or killers had then dragged the body to the signal box and stuffed it inside, perhaps hoping it wouldn't be discovered for weeks or months. The shoes being taken suggested the killer was desperate enough to steal footwear, which implied economic desperation rather than organized crime or a professional killing. This was likely someone who saw an opportunity to rob a vulnerable transient and took it, with the violence escalating beyond robbery to murder. We investigated known criminals in the Cumberland area who had histories of violence or robbery. We looked at other attacks on transients along the B&O line. We checked with police in other railroad towns, asking if they'd had similar incidents. We found a few cases with superficial similarities, but nothing that definitively connected to our victim. By early 1974, the active investigation had stalled. We'd exhausted our obvious leads, interviewed everyone we could find, followed up on every tip. The victim was buried in a Cumberland cemetery in January 1974 in a plot donated by a local church. His grave marker read, "Unknown man, found October 18, 1973. Rest in peace." The case remained open, officially designated as Unidentified Homicide Victim, #4773, the number indicating it was the 47th case assigned by our office in 1973. Periodically over the years, I'd review the file, check new missing persons reports against the victim's description, follow up on any information that came in. In the 1990s, DNA technology advanced enough that we could extract DNA from tissue samples preserved from the autopsy. The DNA profile was entered into databases and compared against missing persons cases. No matches came back. Either his family had never submitted DNA for comparison, or he had no close family, or his family didn't know he was missing and thought he'd just moved on as transients often did. I retired from the B&O Railroad Police in 1999, but the Cumberland Signal Box case stayed with me. I'm 83 years old now, living in Hagerstown, Maryland, and I still think about that young man regularly. He's been dead for 51 years, buried under a marker that doesn't bear his name, and nobody has ever come forward to claim him or explain what happened to him. Over the decades, I've developed a theory about his story. I believe he was a transient, probably from Pennsylvania, based on the matchbook, who'd been riding freight trains looking for work or just traveling. He'd hopped a train that came through Johnstown, ridden it to Cumberland, and had gotten off to rest or to look for day labor. He'd been living rough for several days around the Cumberland rail yards when he encountered someone, possibly another transient, possibly a local, who saw him as an easy target. Maybe there'd been an argument over territory or resources, Or maybe it was just a robbery that escalated. The attacker beat him with a heavy object, killed him, took whatever money he had in his shoes, and dragged his body to the decommissioned signal box to hide it. The killer was probably never caught because he was also transient, someone passing through who left the area immediately after the crime, or he was a local who kept quiet and was never connected to the death. Without the victim's identity, without witnesses, without physical evidence linking anyone to the crime, there was no way to pursue the case beyond the initial investigation. That theory has problems. It requires the victim to have been someone with no family ties, no one who would report him missing, no one who would see his photo in newspapers or on missing persons bulletins and recognize him. It requires the killer to have hidden the body in a location that, while isolated, was still close to active railroad property where maintenance workers might discover it. But it's the most logical explanation given the evidence and the circumstances. What haunts me most is the anonymity. This young man lived for 20-some years, had parents who raised him, probably had siblings or friends, had experiences and memories and thoughts. He ended up riding the rails for whatever reason: economic desperation, adventure, running from something, and he died violently and was buried without anyone knowing his name. The matchbook from the Iron Horse Tavern suggests he had at least passed through Johnstown at some point. Maybe he was from there. Maybe he'd just stopped there on his journey. The denim jacket and the clothes he wore were typical of working-class young men in the 1970s. Nothing distinctive or unusual that would help identify him. The B&O Railroad Police no longer exists as a separate entity. It was merged into other agencies over the years, but the case files were preserved and eventually transferred to the Maryland State Police. The victim's information is in missing persons databases. His DNA profile is in CODIS and other systems. His dental records are documented. Genetic genealogy offers some hope. If investigators could use the victim's DNA to build a family tree and trace relatives, they might finally identify him. It's happened with other unidentified victims from the 1970s and earlier, but it requires resources and time, and cold cases from 50 years ago often don't get prioritized for that kind of intensive effort. The Cumberland community has mostly forgotten about the case. The signal box where he was found was removed decades ago. The railroad line is still active but has changed ownership and configuration over the years. The people who worked the railroad in 1973 are mostly retired or deceased. The businesses and houses near where he was found have changed hands multiple times. But I remember him. I remember standing at that signal box in October 1973, looking at a young man who'd been beaten to death and stuffed into a metal cabinet, and feeling the weight of knowing he was somebody, even if we didn't know who. I remember investigating, trying to give him his name back, trying to find justice for him and failing. I visit his grave occasionally when I'm in Cumberland. I stand there and tell him I'm sorry we never identified him, never caught the person who killed him, never gave him the dignity of being known. I tell him he's not forgotten, that someone still cares about his case, that maybe someday, unlikely as it seems, after 51 years, we'll learn who he was. The grave is well maintained. The cemetery staff take care of it, and occasionally someone leaves flowers, probably people who've heard the story and are moved by it, strangers showing compassion for an unknown victim. There's something touching about that, even though it doesn't change the fundamental tragedy. What I want people to understand is that the man in the signal box was real. He wasn't just unidentified homicide victim, #4773. He was a person who lived and breathed and walked the earth for probably 25 years. He had a childhood, had people who knew him even if they didn't know he died, had a story that led him to those railroad tracks in Cumberland in October 1973. He deserved to live. He deserved to have his full life, to have opportunities and futures. He deserved to be known by his name, to be mourned by people who loved him, to be buried in a grave that bore his real identity. I couldn't give him those things, but I can remember him. I can tell his story. I can insist that he mattered, that his death deserves to be acknowledged, that he's more than just a cold case number. And I can hope that someday, maybe through genetic genealogy, maybe through some relative who finally submits DNA, maybe through some other breakthrough, he'll finally get his name back. When that happens, if it happens, maybe we'll also learn what brought him to Cumberland, what happened in his final days, who killed him, and why. Until then, he rests in that Cumberland cemetery, unknown but not forgotten. His case remains open, his DNA is in databases, and someone, somewhere, might hold the key to finally identifying him. That's all I can offer now. Memory, hope, and the refusal to let him be completely forgotten. It's not justice, not closure, but it's something. And for a young man who died violently beside a railroad track 51 years ago, maybe being remembered is at least a start. He mattered, he was real, and he won't be forgotten. Not as long as there are people who believe that every victim deserves a name and every death deserves to be acknowledged. That's my promise to the man in the signal box, and I'll keep it for whatever time I have left. Rest in peace, whoever you were. You deserve so much better than what you got. My name is Carl Henderson, and I was a game warden with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for 34 years, assigned primarily to Montague County and the surrounding area. In that time, I dealt with all manner of incidents on and around Lake Nocona, boating accidents, fishing violations, the occasional drowning. But in April 1977, I responded to a case that's troubled me for 47 years, a death that was ruled accidental, but that I've never been entirely convinced was anything but deliberate. Lake Nocona sits in North Texas, near the Oklahoma border, a reservoir created in the 1960s by damming Farmers Creek. In 1977, it was a popular spot for fishing, particularly for bass and catfish, and the small communities around it, Bowie, Nocona, Montague, relied on the lake for recreation and some tourism. Roy Balch was 45 years old in 1977, lived in Bowie, worked as a mechanic at a local garage. He was married with 2 teenage kids, well known in the community, a regular at the lake. Roy fished Lake Nocona several times a week, usually alone, often leaving before dawn to get to his favorite spots. He had a 14-foot aluminum boat with a small outboard motor, nothing fancy but reliable. On Thursday, April 14th, 1977, Roy told his wife, Linda, he was going fishing after work. He left the garage around 5 p.m., drove to the public boat ramp on the south side of the lake, and launched his boat. Several people at the ramp that evening remembered seeing Roy. He was a familiar figure, and he'd waved to a couple of other fishermen as he headed out onto the water. That was the last time anyone saw Roy Balch alive. The next morning, Friday, April 15th, around 8:30 a.m., I received a call from the county dispatch. A boat had been found drifting on Lake Nocona, engine running, nobody aboard. The caller was another fisherman who'd spotted it near the eastern shore and had towed it to the nearest dock. I arrived at the scene around 9 a.m. The boat was Roy's. I recognized it immediately. The small outboard motor was still idling when the fisherman found it, gas tank about half full. Roy's tackle box was open on one of the seats, fishing rod propped against the side of the boat as if he'd just set it down. His truck and boat trailer were still at the public ramp where he'd launched the previous evening. There was no sign of Roy, no life jacket in the boat. Roy rarely wore one, a common but dangerous habit among experienced fishermen who got overconfident. No signs of a struggle or disturbance in the boat, just an abandoned vessel drifting on calm water. I immediately called for a search operation. The Montague County Sheriff's Department responded, along with volunteers from the local volunteer fire department and other boaters who wanted to help. We began searching the area where the boat had been found, dragging the bottom with grappling hooks, checking the shoreline, looking for any sign of Roy. Lake Nakona isn't particularly deep, maybe 30 feet at its deepest near the dam, but the water is murky, visibility is poor, and finding a body in several thousand acres of water is challenging. We searched all day Friday with no results. On Saturday, I expanded the search based on water currents and wind patterns, trying to calculate where a body might drift from where the boat had been found. We concentrated on areas near the dam where currents would naturally carry floating objects. On Monday morning, April 18th, 3 days after Roy disappeared, a fisherman found his body. It had surfaced about 200 yards from the dam in about 15 feet of water. I responded immediately, and we carefully recovered the body. Roy was fully clothed, jeans, flannel shirt, work boots, all the clothes he'd been wearing when he left for fishing, but his watch was missing from his wrist. Linda later confirmed he'd been wearing his everyday Timex, and it was definitely gone. His wallet was also missing from his back pocket where he habitually carried it. The body was transported to the Montague County Medical Examiner, Dr. Robert Chin, who performed an autopsy that afternoon. Dr. Chin determined the cause of death was drowning. Roy's lungs contained water consistent with Lake Nakona. There were no signs of trauma beyond minor abrasions that could have occurred post-mortem as the body drifted. Time of death was estimated at sometime Thursday evening, April 14th, probably within a few hours of when Roy had launched his boat. The toxicology results showed no alcohol or drugs in Roy's system. He hadn't been drinking, hadn't been impaired. He'd simply gone into the water somehow and drowned. But several details troubled me, and they troubled the sheriff's investigators as well. First, the missing watch and wallet. If Roy had accidentally fallen overboard and drowned, why were these items missing? Watches don't just fall off wrists underwater. They're strapped on. Wallets don't fall out of back pockets when you're wearing jeans. Someone had removed those items, either before Roy went into the water or after he was dead. Second, I went back to where Roy's truck and trailer were parked at the boat ramp and examined the area more carefully. The boat ramp had a muddy section near the water's edge, and I found footprints there, 2 distinct sets. One set appeared to be Roy's work boots, size 10 or 11, the same boots he'd been found wearing, but there was a second set of prints, smaller, maybe size 9, from a different type of shoe, possibly a sneaker or casual shoe. The print suggested 2 people had been at the ramp together, had walked to the water's edge, and one set of prints, the smaller ones, led back toward the parking area. The larger prints, presumably Roy's, didn't return. It looked like Roy and someone else had been at the ramp together. and only one person had walked away. Third, there were marks on the stern of Roy's boat that suggested it had been pushed off manually rather than driven away under motor power. When you launch a boat normally, you back the trailer into the water, unhook the boat, and drive it off under its own power. These marks looked like someone had physically shoved the boat off the trailer, which was unusual. The investigation shifted from a simple drowning to a potential homicide. We interviewed Linda, Roy's wife, asking about his state of mind, whether he had enemies, whether there were any conflicts in his life. Linda was cooperative but distraught. She insisted Roy had been in good spirits, had no reason to harm himself, had been looking forward to fishing as he always did. We asked about the watch and wallet specifically. Linda confirmed the watch, a Timex with a leather band, and said Roy had been carrying his wallet with his license, about $60 in cash, and some credit cards. She couldn't think of any reason someone would want to rob Roy, and certainly not kill him over $60. We investigated Roy's finances and background. He had no significant debts beyond a mortgage and a car payment. He didn't gamble, at least not beyond the occasional lottery ticket. He had no criminal record, no history of violence or conflicts. He was a regular guy, a mechanic who fished in his free time. But then we heard rumors. Several people mentioned that Roy had been involved in an informal poker game that met weekly at a bar in Bowie. It was supposedly friendly, low stakes, but money changed hands. We talked to the bar owner and some of the regular players. They confirmed Roy participated occasionally, usually on Friday nights. The stakes were modest, maybe $20 or $30, changed hands over the course of an evening. It wasn't serious gambling, just friends playing cards. But one player mentioned that the previous Friday, April 8th, 6 days before Roy died, there'd been an argument. A man named Dale Pritchard, who worked construction and was known around Bowie as someone with a temper, had accused Roy of cheating during the game. Roy had denied it, said Dale was just mad about losing. The argument had gotten heated, and the bar owner had asked both of them to leave. They'd settled down and the game had continued, but there had been tension. We interviewed Dale Pritchard. He was defensive, admitted there had been an argument, but insisted it was nothing serious, just the kind of thing that happens in card games. He had an alibi for Thursday evening, April 14th. He'd been at work on a construction site in Wichita Falls, about 40 miles away, until 7 p.m., then had gone home to his apartment where his girlfriend confirmed he'd been all evening. The alibi wasn't airtight. The girlfriend was obviously biased, but we couldn't prove Dale had been at Lake Nacona. We asked about his shoe size. He wore size 9, which matched the smaller set of footprints at the boat ramp. But size 9 was common, and we couldn't connect those prints definitively to Dale. We searched Dale's apartment with his permission, looking for Roy's watch or wallet. We found nothing. We checked his finances for any sudden influx of cash. Nothing suspicious. We interviewed his co-workers and associates, looking for any indication he'd been involved in Roy's death. Nobody provided information that implicated him. The investigation stalled. We had suspicions but no proof. The physical evidence suggested someone had been with Roy at the boat ramp, had possibly pushed his boat off after he was already in the water or dead, and had taken his watch and wallet, but we couldn't identify who that person was or prove they'd killed Roy, rather than just finding his body and robbing it. Dr. Chen's final ruling was drowning, with manner of death listed as undetermined. That meant he couldn't definitively say whether it was accidental, suicide, or homicide. The missing watch and wallet suggested foul play, but the lack of trauma on the body and the lack of witnesses made it impossible to prove. The case remained open with the Montague County Sheriff's Department as a suspicious death investigation, but without new evidence or witnesses, there wasn't much to actively pursue. Roy was buried in Bowie, his funeral attended by dozens of people from the community. Linda and their children were left with questions that were never answered. Over the years, I continued to check on the case periodically. I'd talk to people around Bowie, asking if they'd heard anything, if any new information had surfaced. I kept an eye on Dale Pritchard, wondering if he'd slip up or confess or do something that would connect him to Roy's death. Dale continued living in the area for several more years, then moved to Oklahoma in the early 1980s. I heard he got into more trouble there. Bar fights, a DUI, eventually some time in prison for assault. He died in 2003 from liver failure, having spent much of his life in and out of legal trouble. If he killed Roy Balk, he never confessed or faced consequences for it. I retired from Texas Parks and Wildlife in 2011 after 34 years. I'm 85 years old now, living in Bowie still, not far from where Roy lived and worked. Lake Nocona is still there, still popular with fishermen, still beautiful, but I think about Roy every time I drive past it. Over the 47 years since Roy's death, I've developed a theory about what happened that April evening. I believe Roy went to the boat ramp planning to fish as he'd told Linda, but someone was there. Possibly Dale Pritchard, possibly someone else Roy knew, who had a grudge or wanted something from Roy. Maybe it was about the poker game. Maybe it was about something else entirely. A debt, a woman, a dispute we never uncovered. This person confronted Roy at the boat ramp. There was an argument, possibly a physical altercation. Roy ended up in the water. Maybe he was pushed. Maybe he fell during a struggle. Maybe he was struck unconscious first and then put in the water. The person then took Roy's watch and wallet, either as a robbery or to make it look like a robbery. They pushed Roy's boat off the trailer and let it drift out onto the lake with the motor idling, hoping it would be found far from the boat ramp and the death would look like an accidental drowning far from shore. They then left the area, walking back to their vehicle parked nearby. The smaller footprints at the boat ramp were theirs. They drove away, and Roy's body drifted for 3 days before surfacing near the dam. That theory fits the physical evidence, the 2 sets of footprints, the marks on the boat suggesting it was pushed off manually, the missing watch and wallet, the lack of significant trauma, suggesting Roy might have been conscious when he went into the water but unable to swim to safety. But I can't prove it. The person who confronted Roy that evening has never been identified with certainty. The watch and wallet were never recovered. The case remains officially unsolved, manner of death undetermined. Roy's family has lived with that uncertainty for 47 years. Linda remarried in the mid-1980s and moved to Oklahoma. The kids grew up, had their own families, carried the weight of not knowing exactly what happened to their father. They've accepted that they'll probably never get definitive answers, but the questions linger. The case file is still maintained by the Montague County Sheriff's Department. Periodically, when a detective has time, they'll review it, check for any new information or connections. DNA technology has advanced since 1977, but without biological evidence from a suspect, there's nothing to test. The physical evidence from the scene, the footprints, the boat, Roy's clothing, was documented, but doesn't contain DNA that would identify someone. What troubles me most is the simplicity of it. Roy went fishing on a Thursday evening. something he'd done hundreds of times before. He ended up dead in Lake Nocona with his watch and wallet missing, and we never figured out exactly what happened or who was responsible. It's likely someone in the Bowie community knows something, saw something that evening, heard rumors, has information they never shared with authorities. Small towns keep secrets, and people protect their own or stay silent out of fear. Maybe the person responsible confessed to a friend or family member who's kept that secret for 47 years. Or maybe I'm wrong about my theory. Maybe Roy did accidentally fall from his boat, and the missing watch and wallet were taken by someone who found his body before we did, some opportunistic thief who saw a drowned man and robbed him. Maybe the second set of footprints at the boat ramp were from someone completely unrelated, someone who happened to be there around the same time. But I don't believe that. My gut tells me Roy's death wasn't an accident. Someone knows what happened that April evening, and they've never come forward. That person has lived with that secret for 47 years, and they'll probably take it to their grave just as Dale Pritchard did, if Dale was even involved. Roy Balch deserved better. He was a good man, a hard worker, a husband and father who loved fishing and lived a quiet life. He should have come home from Lake Nocona that Thursday evening, cleaned his fish, had dinner with his family. Instead, he ended up dead in the water, and his family was left with decades of unanswered questions. I couldn't give them answers. I couldn't prove what happened or who was responsible. I couldn't bring Roy justice, but I can remember him. I can tell his story. I can insist that his death mattered, that it wasn't just another drowning statistic, but a suspicious death that deserves to be acknowledged. And I can hope that someday, unlikely as it seems, after 47 years, someone will come forward with information that finally explains what happened to Roy Balch on Lake Nocona in April 1977. Until then, Roy rests in the Bowie Cemetery, his death officially undetermined, his case officially unsolved. But he's not forgotten. His family remembers him. I remember him. And anyone who hears his story will know that he was real, that he mattered, that his death deserves more than the uncertainty it's been given. That's all I can offer now. Memory, acknowledgement, and the hope that truth, however delayed, will eventually surface. It's not justice, not closure, but it's something. And for a 45-year-old mechanic who went fishing one April evening and never came home, maybe being remembered is at least a start. Roy, wherever you are, you deserve so much better. I'm sorry we couldn't give you justice, but you're not forgotten. You never will be. My name is Thomas Riley, and I was a detective with the Los Angeles Police Department for 29 years, working primarily out of the Hollywood Division. In that time, I investigated hundreds of cases in and around the entertainment industry: overdoses, suicides, assaults, the occasional homicide. The music scene in particular was rife with drugs, exploitation, and violence beneath its glamorous surface. But in March 1982, I investigated the disappearance of a young musician named Glenn Parsons, a case that has troubled me for 42 years because every logical explanation has problems, and the most likely truth is one we could never prove. Laurel Canyon in 1982 was a legendary neighborhood in the Hollywood Hills, known for its winding roads, hillside homes, and rich musical history. In the 1960s and 70s, musicians like Joni Mitchell, Jim Morrison, and Frank Zappa had lived there, and by the early 80s, it still attracted aspiring artists, hoping to make it in the music industry. Small recording studios operated in converted garages and basements, and the area had a bohemian, creative atmosphere that young musicians found appealing. Glenn Parsons was 24 years old, from San Diego originally, had moved to Los Angeles in 1980, trying to make it as a singer-songwriter. He played guitar, wrote his own material, performed at clubs around Hollywood and West LA, and was starting to get some attention from small record labels. He wasn't famous, but people in the local music scene knew him and thought he had potential. On the night of March 12, 1982, a Friday, Glenn was at a small recording studio on Kirkwood Drive in Laurel Canyon, working on demo recordings with a few other musicians. The session had started around 8 p.m. and ran late, as these things often did. According to the other musicians present, a drummer named Mike Torres and a bassist named Sarah Chin, Glenn was in good spirits, excited about the songs they were recording, talking about shopping the demo to labels once it was finished. The session wrapped up around 1:45 a.m. Glenn packed up his guitar, a Gibson acoustic he was rarely without, said goodnight to Mike and Sarah, and walked to his car, a 1976 Datsun 510, light blue, parked on the street outside the studio. That was the last time anyone saw Glenn Parsons. Around 2:30 a.m., LAPD received a 911 call from a resident on Laurel Canyon Boulevard reporting what sounded like a car crash, a loud noise, screeching tires, possibly an impact. Officers were dispatched to check the area. They drove the winding roads of Laurel Canyon looking for an accident but found nothing initially. Then around 3:15 a.m., Officer David Kim spotted a car parked on the side of Laurel Canyon Boulevard, about half a mile from the recording studio where Glenn had been. The car was a light blue Datsun 510, pulled onto the narrow shoulder at a curve in the road. The engine was running, headlights on, driver's door standing wide open. Officer Kim approached cautiously and looked inside. Nobody was in the vehicle. The keys were in the ignition, the car was in park, and on the back seat was a guitar case, a Gibson acoustic inside, later confirmed to belong to Glenn. Glenn's wallet was in the center console, containing his driver's license and about $40. His watch, a Timex with a leather band, was on the dashboard as if he'd taken it off while driving. The car appeared otherwise normal, no signs of a struggle, no blood, no indication of what had happened to the driver. Officer Kim radioed for assistance, and I was called out around 4 a.m. I arrived at the scene as the sun was starting to come up, providing better light to examine the area. Glenn's car was positioned on a curve where Laurel Canyon Boulevard makes a sharp bend. The road there is narrow, bordered by steep hillsides, uphill on one side, a drop-off on the other protected by a low guardrail. The car was pulled onto the shoulder on the uphill side, driver's door open toward the road. I examined the vehicle thoroughly. The engine was still running when officers arrived and had been turned off. The gas tank was about a quarter full. The car was in good mechanical condition. No flat tires, no engine problems. No reason Glenn would have stopped for a mechanical issue. There were no skid marks on the road indicating sudden braking or loss of control. The car hadn't been in an accident, no damage to the body, no signs of impact. Whatever had caused Glenn to stop, it hadn't been a crash, despite the residents' report of hearing what sounded like one. I walked the area with flashlights, looking for any sign of Glenn. The uphill side was steep, covered with brush and trees. The downhill side dropped off sharply, about 20 feet down to more vegetation and eventually private properties below. I could see where the guardrail was damaged in one spot. The metal bent outward as if something heavy had hit it, but that damage appeared old, weathered, probably from a previous accident. We called in search teams at dawn. Officers and volunteers walked the hillsides above and below the road, calling Glenn's name, looking for any sign he'd fallen or wandered off. We brought in dogs to track his scent. The dogs picked up Glenn's scent from the car and followed it along the road for about 50 yards in both directions, then lost it. It was as if he'd walked along the road briefly and then vanished. The investigation shifted to understanding what had happened. I contacted Mike Torres and Sarah Chin, the musicians who'd been with Glenn at the recording session. They gave statements about the evening. Glenn had seemed normal, maybe a bit tired, but in good spirits. He'd left around 1:45 a.m., said he was driving home to his apartment in West Hollywood. The route from the recording studio to Glenn's apartment would have taken him down Laurel Canyon Boulevard, the same road where his car was found. He would have driven past that location heading south towards Sunset Boulevard, but for some reason he'd stopped at that curve, left his car running with the door open, and disappeared. We interviewed neighbors along that stretch of road, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual between 1:45 and 3 a.m. The resident who'd called 911 about hearing a crash said it had sounded like metal hitting metal, tires screeching, but looking out the window, she hadn't seen anything. She'd assumed it was further down the road and had called it in but hadn't gone to investigate herself. Another resident, an elderly man named Harold Chin, who lived in a house overlooking that curve, mentioned he'd been awakened by voices around 2 o'clock or 2:30 a.m. Men's voices sounded like an argument or heated conversation. He couldn't see what was happening because his view of the road was blocked by trees, and he'd gone back to sleep, assuming it was just people leaving a party. He couldn't say how many voices or what they'd been arguing about. Those witness reports, the sound of a crash, the voices arguing, suggested something had happened on that road around 2 a.m., but we couldn't determine what. No crash site was found. No evidence of a fight or struggle at the location where Glenn's car was found. We investigated Glenn's background and recent activities. His roommate, a guy named Danny Foster, who also worked in the music industry, said Glenn had been acting paranoid over the past few weeks. Glenn had mentioned he thought someone was following him, though he couldn't identify who or why. He'd gotten into what Danny described as a bad business deal with someone, though Glenn had been vague about the details. We pressed Danny for more information. He said Glenn had been trying to get financial backing for his music career and had borrowed money from someone, not a bank, not a formal loan, but cash from an individual who expected to be repaid with interest. Danny didn't know how much money or who the lender was, just that Glenn had been stressed about it recently, mentioned he was behind on payments. That raised the possibility of loan sharks or other criminal elements. If Glenn had borrowed money from dangerous people and couldn't repay it, that could explain his paranoia and potentially his disappearance. We investigated known loan sharks and criminals operating in the Hollywood area, asking if they'd had dealings with Glenn. Nobody admitted to it, and we couldn't prove any connections. Glenn's family, his parents in San Diego, his younger sister, were contacted and interviewed. They hadn't heard from Glenn in about a week, which wasn't unusual. Glenn called home occasionally, but wasn't in constant contact. They'd known he was struggling financially, trying to make it in music, but hadn't known about any loans or dangerous situations. They were devastated by his disappearance and flew to Los Angeles immediately to help with the search. We checked Glenn's finances. His bank account showed he was barely scraping by. Deposits from occasional gigs, withdrawals for rent and basic expenses. There were no large deposits or withdrawals that would indicate significant loans or payoffs. If he'd borrowed money, it had been cash transactions that left no paper trail. Glenn's apartment in West Hollywood was searched with his roommate's permission. We found typical musician stuff: guitars, recording equipment, notebooks full of lyrics and chord progressions, posters of bands on the walls. We also found a notebook that appeared to be a journal of sorts. The last entry, dated March 10th, 2 days before Glenn disappeared, said, "Can't shake the feeling I'm being watched. Same car twice this week. Think it was following me. Need to deal with the money situation soon. Getting calls at weird hours, hang-ups. Maybe I'm just paranoid. Sarah says I need to relax, but she doesn't understand the pressure." That entry confirmed Glenn's paranoia and suggested he was receiving threatening calls. We checked his phone records. In the week before his disappearance, he'd received several calls from payphones, which couldn't be traced to specific callers. The pattern suggested someone had been calling him deliberately, possibly to intimidate or threaten him. The investigation considered several scenarios. First, Glenn had been forced off the road by another vehicle, possibly the same person or people he believed were following him. They'd confronted him, forced him into their vehicle, and taken him somewhere. His car had been left running to suggest he'd stepped out briefly and would return, creating confusion about when he'd actually disappeared. Second, Glenn had stopped to meet someone, possibly the person he owed money to, thinking he could negotiate or resolve the debt. The meeting had gone wrong, turned violent, and Glenn had been killed or abducted. The person had left Glenn's car running and driven away with him. Third, Glenn had staged his own disappearance to escape the debt and start over somewhere else. He'd arranged for someone to pick him up at that location, had left his car running to make it look like a sudden disappearance, and had fled to another state or country. The first two scenarios suggested foul play. The third suggested Glenn was alive somewhere, hiding voluntarily. We investigated all three possibilities. We looked for evidence Glenn had planned to disappear, withdrawals of large amounts of cash, purchase of bus or plane tickets, conversations with friends about leaving. We found nothing. Glenn's financial situation was too precarious for him to have saved money for a planned escape, and nobody reported him talking about leaving Los Angeles. We investigated people Glenn had interacted with recently, club owners where he'd performed, other musicians, people from the music industry. A few had heard Glenn mention financial troubles, but nobody could identify who he'd borrowed money from or who might have threatened him. The case generated media attention. Missing musician Glenn Parsons, Laurel Canyon mystery. Aspiring singer vanishes after recording session. Glenn's photo was circulated throughout Los Angeles and Southern California. Tips came in, people claiming to have seen him in various locations, but each tip was investigated and led nowhere. By summer 1982, the active investigation had stalled. We'd exhausted our leads, interviewed everyone connected to Glenn, followed up on every tip. Glenn's car was processed for forensic evidence. We found only Glenn's fingerprints and those of his roommate and a few other people who'd ridden in it. Nothing suggested anyone else had been in the car the night he disappeared. Glenn's guitar remained in evidence storage, a poignant reminder of the life he'd been building and the future that was interrupted. His family held a memorial service in San Diego in August 1982, Though Glenn wasn't legally declared dead for several more years, the case remained open as a missing persons investigation, occasionally seeing renewed attention when other missing persons cases or bodies were discovered in the LA area. Each time I'd check if it might be Glenn, but nothing ever matched. I retired from LAPD in 2011 after 29 years. Glenn Parsons' case was one of several major unsolved cases from my career, but this one affected me differently because of the young man's dreams and the cruel randomness of how they'd been interrupted. I'm 81 years old now, living in Pasadena, and I still think about Glenn regularly. Over the 42 years since he disappeared, I've developed a strong theory about what happened, though I can never prove it. I believe Glenn borrowed money from someone connected to organized crime or the criminal underworld, not a major figure, but someone dangerous enough to use violence to collect debts. Glenn had been unable to repay the loan and had been receiving threatening calls. He'd mentioned being followed, feeling paranoid, all signs someone was pressuring him. On the night of March 12th, I believe Glenn was forced off the road by another vehicle as he drove home from the recording session. The vehicle blocked his path at that curve on Laurel Canyon Boulevard, forcing him to stop. The person or persons confronted Glenn. There was a brief argument or struggle. The voices Harold Chin heard, and Glenn was forced into their vehicle. They left Glenn's car running with the door open, either deliberately to create confusion or simply because they didn't care. They drove away with Glenn, took him somewhere remote, killed him, and disposed of his body in a location it's never been found, perhaps in the mountains, perhaps buried in the desert, perhaps weighted and dumped in the ocean. The sound of a crash, the neighbor reported, might have been the sound of the vehicles meeting forcefully, or a door slamming, or something else associated with the confrontation. Sounds carrying strangely in the canyon at night, misinterpreted as a crash. That theory fits all the known facts. Glenn's paranoia, the threatening calls, the car left running with the door open, the voices arguing, Glenn's complete disappearance without trace. It explains why his wallet and watch were left behind. He wasn't robbed. He was collected for a debt, but I can't prove it. We never identified who Glenn borrowed money from. We never found witnesses who saw the confrontation. We never found Glenn's body. The person or people responsible disappeared as completely as Glenn did, leaving behind only questions and a running car on a dark canyon road. Glenn's family lived with the uncertainty for years. His parents both died in the 2000s without knowing what happened to their son. His sister still lives in San Diego, now in her 60s, and occasionally contacts cold case investigators asking if there's been any progress. There never has been. The Gibson guitar Glenn left in his car was eventually returned to his family. His sister keeps it in her home, a memorial to her brother's musical dreams and the life that was cut short. Glenn Parsons' case remains officially open with LAPD's cold case unit. If his remains are ever found, dental records are ready for comparison. If any new information surfaces, investigators will follow up. But after 42 years, the likelihood of solving the case is minimal. What I want people to understand is that Glenn wasn't just a missing person or a cold case number. He was a talented 24-year-old musician with dreams and ambitions. He wrote songs, played guitar beautifully, according to people who heard him, was starting to get recognition in the local music scene. He should have had a long career ahead of him, should have had the chance to make the music he loved. Instead, he drove home from a recording session on a March night in 1982 and was never seen again. His car sat running on Laurel Canyon Boulevard, with the door open, his guitar in the back seat, and he was gone. He deserved better. He deserved to live, to pursue his dreams, to have a future. He deserved justice. Whoever took him should have been caught and held accountable. His family deserved answers and closure. I couldn't give them those things. I investigated thoroughly, followed every lead, did everything I could, but it wasn't enough. Glenn remains missing, his fate unknown, his case unsolved. But he's not forgotten. His family remembers him. I remember him. People in the LA music scene who knew him remember him. And anyone who hears his story will know he was real, that he mattered, that his life and his music deserved more than they got. That's all I can offer now. Memory, acknowledgement, and the hope that someday, somehow, the truth will surface. Maybe someone will confess on their deathbed. Maybe remains will be found and identified. Maybe genetic genealogy will connect to family members who can provide information. Until then, Glenn Parsons rests somewhere unknown, a young musician whose dreams were stolen on a dark canyon road in 1982. But he's not forgotten. Not as long as there are people who believe every missing person deserves to be found and every life deserves to be remembered. That's my promise to Glenn and his family, and I'll keep it for whatever time I have left. Glenn, wherever you are, you deserved so much better. Your music mattered. Your life mattered. And you won't be forgotten. The night the music stopped on Laurel Canyon Boulevard, a talented young man vanished, but his memory plays on, and it will continue until the day truth finally arrives, and justice, however delayed, is finally served. Rest in peace, Glenn. You're not forgotten. You never will be. My name is Frank Martinez, and I was a detective with the Arizona Department of Public Safety for 31 years, working primarily out of Yuma in the southwestern corner of the state. In that time, I investigated crimes ranging from drug trafficking to homicides, dealing with the unique challenges of a border region where criminal activity often crossed international lines. But in June 1980, I investigated a double homicide that has haunted me for 44 years. 2 people burned beyond recognition in a station wagon on an abandoned airstrip, their identities unknown, their killers never caught. The area west of Yuma is harsh desert, sand, scrub brush, intense heat, and vast emptiness. In 1980, this region was known for 2 things: agriculture near the Colorado River and drug smuggling. The border with Mexico was porous, and remote areas were used by traffickers moving marijuana, heroin, and other contraband from Mexico into the United States. Abandoned airstrips from World War II training operations dotted the desert, and some were used by smugglers flying in drugs. On June 17, 1980, a Tuesday afternoon around 3 p.m., 2 private pilots, Tom Andrews and his son Kevin, who flew survey work for agricultural companies, were conducting a flight over the desert west of Yuma. They were at low altitude, checking irrigation systems and crop patterns, when Kevin spotted something unusual: a burned vehicle on what looked like an old airstrip. Tom circled back for a closer look. The airstrip was one of many remnants from the 1940s, a dirt runway about 3,000 feet long since abandoned, unmarked on most current maps, and clearly visible on the runway was a burned-out vehicle. Tom and Kevin landed at Yuma International Airport and reported what they'd seen. The Yuma County Sheriff's Department was notified, and I was assigned to investigate along with Sheriff's Deputy Robert Shin. We flew out to the location in a department helicopter around 5 p.m. The abandoned airstrip was about 30 miles west of Yuma, accessible only by rough dirt roads that would take hours to navigate by vehicle. From the air, we could see the burned vehicle clearly, a station wagon, completely gutted by fire, sitting in the middle of the runway. We landed nearby and approached on foot. The heat was oppressive, probably 110 degrees, and the smell of burned metal and rubber was still detectable despite the fire having obviously occurred days earlier. The station wagon was a shell, windows blown out, tires melted, paint burned away, interior completely destroyed, and inside were the remains. 2 bodies, burned beyond recognition, one in the driver's seat and one in the passenger seat. Both appeared to be adults based on size, but gender and other identifying characteristics were impossible to determine from visual inspection alone. We immediately secured the scene and called for additional resources: the county medical examiner, crime scene investigators, forensic specialists. Getting everyone to this remote location would take time, but we needed proper processing of what was clearly a double homicide. While waiting for the team to arrive, I examined the area around the vehicle and the airstrip. There were tire tracks in the sand and dirt. Multiple vehicles had been here relatively recently, though the desert wind and sun made it difficult to determine exactly when. The airstrip itself showed signs of occasional use. The dirt was packed down in places as if planes had landed, though there was no way to know when. The vehicle's VIN plate was missing, not just filed off but completely removed. The metal where it should have been was blank. The license plates were still attached, front and back, Arizona plates. I ran them through dispatch. They came back as stolen from a vehicle in Las Vegas, Nevada, 3 months earlier in March 1980. By the time the sun set, we had a full investigative team at the scene. Generator-powered lights were set up, and the crime scene was processed throughout the night. The bodies were carefully removed and transported to the morgue. The burned vehicle was documented from every angle, then loaded onto a flatbed truck for transport to a forensic facility. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Sullivan, conducted autopsies the next day. Despite the severe fire damage, she was able to determine several critical facts. Both victims were adults. Victim #1, driver's seat, was male, approximately 30, 45 years old based on bone structure and dental wear. Victim #2, passenger seat, was female, approximately 25, 40 years old. Both had been shot in the head before the fire. Small caliber bullets, probably .22 or .25, execution-style shots to the back of the head. They'd been dead when the vehicle was burned. The fire had been set deliberately. Accelerant, gasoline, had been poured throughout the interior and ignited. The intensity of the fire and the remote location had allowed it to burn completely, destroying most potential evidence. The victims' dental records were documented and compared against missing persons reports. Their fingerprints were gone, destroyed by the fire. In 1980, DNA analysis wasn't available for identification purposes. We had to rely on dental records and physical characteristics. Over the following weeks, we compared the victims against missing persons cases throughout Arizona and surrounding states. We checked with Nevada authorities, given the stolen plates from Las Vegas. We circulated descriptions: adult male and adult female, approximate ages, found in burned vehicle in Arizona desert, hoping someone would come forward. Nobody did. The victims didn't match any missing persons reports we could find. Either nobody had reported them missing, or their reports were filed in jurisdictions we didn't check, or they were people living on the margins who wouldn't be officially reported missing. The vehicle itself was examined extensively. It was determined to be a 1976 Ford Country Squire station wagon, light-colored, probably tan or beige based on paint traces that survived the fire. But with the VIN removed and the plates stolen, we couldn't trace its ownership. Ford had manufactured thousands of Country Squires in that model year, sold them across the country. Without the VIN, the vehicle was untraceable. The investigation focused on the why as well as the who. The execution-style killings and the location suggested organized crime, likely drug trafficking. The abandoned airstrip was exactly the kind of place smugglers would use: remote, unmonitored, large enough to land small planes. The theory developed that the victims were involved in drug smuggling and had been killed by partners or rivals. Their bodies and vehicle burned to destroy evidence, but forensic testing of the vehicle and the remains found no drug residue, no contraband, no evidence they'd been transporting drugs. We searched the area around the airstrip thoroughly, looking for drugs that might have been offloaded before the murders. We found nothing. We investigated known drug trafficking organizations operating in the Yuma area. We interviewed informants, checked with DEA agents working the border region, looked at recent busts and seizures. Nobody had information about a double homicide or missing traffickers. Then we found the medallion. During the final processing of the ash and debris from inside the vehicle, a forensic technician found a small gold object partially melted but still identifiable, a St. Christopher medallion, the kind worn on a chain around the neck as religious jewelry or a good luck charm. It had been near where the female victim's remains were found, suggesting it had been hers. The medallion was examined by a jeweler who determined it was real gold, probably 14 karat, of a style popular in the 1960s and 70s. On the back was a partial inscription, damaged by the fire but still readable: Love M. The beginning of the inscription had been destroyed, but Love M suggested it had been a gift from someone whose name started with M. That medallion became a focus of the investigation. We circulated photographs of it, hoping someone would recognize it and connect it to the female victim. We asked jewelers throughout Arizona and Nevada if they remembered selling or engraving such a medallion. A few people thought they might have sold similar ones, but nobody could provide specific information that led to identification. The investigation continued through 1980 and into 1981. We followed every lead, interviewed dozens of people, checked with law enforcement agencies across multiple states. The theory that the victims were drug traffickers gradually lost support as we found no evidence supporting it. Alternative theories emerged. Maybe they were witnesses to something. Maybe they were involved in a robbery or scam. Maybe they'd run afoul of someone dangerous for reasons unrelated to drugs. But without knowing who they were, we couldn't determine why they'd been killed. The case became a circular puzzle. We needed to identify the victims to understand the motive, but we couldn't identify them without more information than we had. By 1982, the active investigation had largely stalled. The case remained open. The victims were buried in unmarked graves in a Yuma cemetery, later given simple markers reading "unknown male" and "unknown female," found June 1980, and the burned station wagon was stored as evidence. Over the decades, the case would occasionally see renewed interest. In the 1990s, DNA was finally extracted from bone samples preserved from both victims. The DNA profiles were entered into databases and compared against missing persons cases. No matches came back. In the 2000s, the case was featured on websites dedicated to unidentified victims. Forensic artists created facial reconstructions based on the skulls, showing what the victims might have looked like. The images were circulated online and through missing persons networks. A few tips came in from people who thought the reconstructions looked like someone they'd known, but when investigated, none led to definitive identifications. I retired from the Arizona DPS in 2011 after 31 years. The Desert Airfield murders remained one of several major unsolved cases from my career, but this one affected me differently because of the complete mystery. We didn't know who the victims were, who killed them, or why. It was as if two people had been erased from existence, leaving behind only burned bones and a melted gold medallion. I'm 85 years old now, living in Yuma still, and I think about those two people regularly. Over the 44 years since they were found, I've developed theories about what happened. I believe the victims were involved in something criminal, maybe not drug trafficking, but something that put them in contact with dangerous people. The execution-style killings suggest professional hits or punishment killings, not crimes of passion or robbery gone wrong. The remote location and the burning of the vehicle suggest the killers wanted to destroy evidence and make identification difficult. They removed the VIN, used stolen plates, chose a place where the bodies wouldn't be found for days or weeks. If the pilots hadn't spotted them by chance, they might not have been discovered for months. My theory is that the victims were from elsewhere, possibly Las Vegas, given the stolen Nevada plates, and were brought to Arizona to be killed, or they drove there themselves and were ambushed. The abandoned airstrip might have been chosen as a meeting location, and when they arrived, they were executed and burned. The St. Christopher medallion suggests the female victim was Catholic, or had been given the medallion by someone Catholic. The inscription Love M suggests someone close to her, possibly a family member, possibly a romantic partner, but without knowing who she was, we couldn't track down who M might be. The lack of missing persons reports is the most puzzling aspect. Two adults don't just vanish without anyone noticing. Either their families didn't report them missing because they were estranged, or believed the victims had left voluntarily, or the victims were involved in activities where disappearing wasn't unusual, or they were reported missing somewhere we never checked. That theory has problems. It requires the victims to have traveled from elsewhere, possibly Nevada, to Arizona, to have been involved in something criminal enough to get them killed, and to have left no trail that would help us identify them. It's possible, but it requires a specific set of circumstances. The alternative, that they were local to Arizona, were killed for reasons unrelated to organized crime, and just happened to be disposed of at that airstrip, seems less likely, but can't be ruled out. The case remains officially open with the Yuma County Sheriff's Department. The DNA profiles exist in national databases. The St. Christopher medallion is preserved as evidence. The facial reconstructions are available online. If anyone recognizes the victims or has information, there are still investigators who would follow up. Genetic genealogy offers hope. If investigators could use the victims' DNA to build family trees and identify relatives, they might finally learn who these people were. It's been done with other unidentified victims from the 1970s and 80s, but it requires resources and time. In cases from 44 years ago, don't always get prioritized. What haunts me most is the anonymity. Two people lived for probably 30 or so years, had childhoods and families and experiences, ended up in that station wagon on that airstrip in June 1980, and were executed and burned, and nobody came forward to claim them, to identify them, to explain what happened to them. They deserved better. They deserved to be known, to be identified, to be buried under their real names with their families able to mourn them properly. They deserved justice, their killers caught and held accountable. I couldn't give them those things. I investigated thoroughly, followed every lead, did everything I could with the resources and technology available. But it wasn't enough. They remain unknown, their killers unidentified, their deaths a mystery. But they're not forgotten. I remember them. Other investigators who worked the case remember them. People who've heard their story care about solving it. And someday, maybe through genetic genealogy, maybe through some other breakthrough, they might finally get their names back. Until then, they rest in that Yuma cemetery. Two people who died together in the Arizona desert, whose story remains unfinished. But they're not forgotten. Not as long as there are people who believe that every victim deserves a name and every death deserves to be solved. That's my promise to the two people found at the desert airfield in June 1980, and I'll keep it for whatever time I have left. You deserved so much better than what you got, but you're not forgotten. You never will be. The desert keeps many secrets, but memory endures, and your story will continue to be told until the day truth finally surfaces and you get the justice and identification you deserve. Rest in peace, whoever you were. You mattered, you were real, and you won't be forgotten. My name is William Bill Carson, and I was a detective with the Arkansas State Police for 33 years, covering multiple counties in the northern part of the state. In that time, I worked hundreds of cases throughout the Ozarks, a region of natural beauty but also isolation, poverty, and the occasional violence that comes from people living in close-knit communities where old grudges run deep. But in November 1986, I investigated a quadruple homicide that remains the most brutal unsolved case of my career, a crime that devastated a small town and left questions that have haunted me for 38 years. Pine Hollow was a town of maybe 500 people in Madison County, deep in the Ozarks. It was a farming community mostly, with families who'd lived there for generations, working land that had been in their names for 100 years or more. The Miller family was one of those families. Glenn Miller, 48 years old, his wife Donna, 45, and their two children, Travis, 16, and Emily, 13. They ran a small cattle operation on 240 acres, about 3 miles outside Pine Hollow proper. On November 19, 1986, a Wednesday evening, the Miller family sat down for dinner around 6 o'clock p.m., a typical farm family dinner, homemade food, everyone gathered at the kitchen table. They never finished that meal. The bodies were discovered the next morning, Thursday, November 20th, around 8:30 a.m., by a neighbor named Robert Hayes, who'd stopped by to borrow some tools. When nobody answered his knock at the front door, he walked around to the back and looked through the kitchen window. What he saw made him immediately drive to the nearest phone to call the sheriff. I arrived at the scene around 10:30 a.m., along with the Madison County Sheriff, Tom Morrison, and multiple deputies. What we found was a scene of calculated violence that still makes me sick to think about. All 4 members of the Miller family were in the kitchen. still seated at the dining table or slumped in their chairs. They'd each been shot at close range with what appeared to be a shotgun. The wounds were devastating, suggesting buckshot fired from maybe 10 to 15 feet away. The attack had been sudden and overwhelming. Plates of food were still on the table, partially eaten, glasses of milk and tea knocked over, the meal interrupted by violence. Glenn Miller sat at the head of the table, killed by a shotgun blast to the chest. Donna was across from him, shot in the head. Travis and Emily were on either side of the table, both shot in the upper body. The medical examiner would later confirm that all four had died within minutes of each other, probably within a minute or two, suggesting a rapid attack by someone who fired multiple times in quick succession. The front door had been kicked in. The wooden frame was splintered where the lock had been, the door hanging askew on its hinges. Muddy boot prints led from the front door through the living room and into the kitchen, clearly visible on the worn wooden floors. The killer or killers had entered forcefully, moved directly to where the family was eating, and opened fire. But what made the scene particularly eerie was what happened after. The muddy boot prints continued from the kitchen, through a mudroom and out the back door onto the porch. On the porch, the prints were still visible in the accumulated dust and dirt, but they stopped at the edge of the porch, about 8 feet from the back door. Just stopped. No prints leading down the steps into the yard, no indication of where the person had gone from there. We processed the scene meticulously. The boot prints were photographed and measured, size 11 or 12, work boots with a distinctive tread pattern common to several brands sold at farm supply stores. We cast the prints for later comparison. We collected shotgun pellets and wadding from the scene, 12-gauge buckshot, standard ammunition available anywhere in rural Arkansas. We fingerprinted surfaces throughout the house, looking for prints that didn't belong to the family. The house was otherwise undisturbed. Nothing had been stolen. Glenn's wallet was in the bedroom with about $200. Donna's purse was in the living room with cash and credit cards. The television and other valuables were present. This hadn't been a robbery. There were no signs of sexual assault. The attack had been focused, purposeful. Someone had come to that house specifically to kill the Miller family, had done so efficiently, and had left immediately after. The medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Bennett, conducted autopsies and confirmed what the scene had suggested. All four victims had been killed by shotgun blasts at close range. Time of death was estimated between 6 o'clock and 7 p.m. Wednesday evening. The shotgun had been fired at least 5 times. One shot had missed or grazed, evidenced by pellets embedded in the kitchen wall. The investigation immediately focused on who would want to kill the entire Miller family and why. We interviewed neighbors, friends, people in Pine Hollow who knew the Millers. Several themes emerged from those conversations. First, the Millers were generally well-liked, but had been involved in some disputes recently. Glenn could be stubborn and confrontational when he felt he was in the right. He'd had conflicts with neighboring ranchers over cattle that had wandered onto his property, over fence lines, over water rights, the kind of disputes that are common in rural areas but that usually don't escalate to violence. Second, the Millers had been in a significant conflict over the past 6 months with a land surveyor named Vincent Talley. Talley had been hired by a development company that was buying land in Madison County with plans to build vacation homes and possibly a resort. Talley had been surveying property lines to determine exactly what land the development company was purchasing. According to multiple witnesses, Glenn Miller believed Talley's surveys were incorrect, that Tally was deliberately shifting property lines to give the development company more land than they'd actually purchased. Glenn had confronted Tally several times, the arguments getting heated. Glenn had hired his own surveyor who'd come up with different measurements, and the dispute had escalated to the point where lawyers were involved. People in Pine Hollow mentioned that Glenn had been talking about filing a formal complaint against Tally with the state licensing board, accusing him of fraud and professional misconduct. Several people said Tally had been angry about this, had made comments to others about Glenn sticking his nose where it didn't belong, and causing problems for people just trying to do their jobs. We immediately sought to interview Vincent Tally. We learned he'd been living in a rental house in Pine Hollow while working on the surveying project, but when we went to the address, he was gone. The landlord said Tally had moved out suddenly on November 20th, the morning after the murders, claiming a family emergency back in Missouri where he was from. He'd paid what he owed and left no forwarding address. That timing was extremely suspicious. We put out bulletins for Tally's vehicle, a white Ford pickup truck with Missouri plates, and requested Missouri authorities locate him for questioning. We also requested a warrant to search his former rental house in Pine Hollow. The search of Tally's rental revealed that he'd left in a hurry. Some personal items remained: clothes in the closet, some canned food in the kitchen, a few tools in the garage, but anything important, documents, files, personal papers, was gone. The landlord said when she'd asked Tally if he wanted to take the remaining items or if she should discard them, he'd told her to throw it all away, I won't be back. We found muddy work boots in the garage. They were size 12, the same size as the prints at the Miller house. We collected them as evidence and sent them to the state crime lab for comparison. The tread pattern matched the prints found at the crime scene. That wasn't definitive proof. The boots were a common brand sold throughout Arkansas and surrounding states, but it was highly suggestive. We also found shotgun shells in Tally's garage, 12 gauge, the same type used to kill the Miller family. Again, not definitive. 12 gauge shotguns were ubiquitous in rural Arkansas, but circumstantial evidence was building. Missouri State Police located Vincent Tally in his hometown of Springfield about a week after the murders. He was living with family, had started working a new job. We traveled to Missouri to interview him. Tally was 42 years old, divorced, had worked as a land surveyor for about 15 years. He was calm during the interview, cooperative, expressed shock when we told him the Miller family had been murdered. He said he'd heard about it. It had been news even in Missouri, a quadruple homicide in rural Arkansas, but hadn't connected it to the people he'd been feuding with. We asked about the property line dispute. Tally admitted there had been disagreements, said Glenn Miller had been unreasonable and confrontational, but insisted the surveys had been accurate and that Glenn was simply wrong about where the boundaries were. He said Glenn had threatened to ruin his reputation and career with false accusations to the licensing board. We asked about his whereabouts. Wednesday evening, November 19th, Tally said he'd been at his rental house in Pine Hollow alone, working on paperwork and preparing to leave Arkansas because the surveying project was winding down. He'd gone to bed early, hadn't gone out, hadn't seen anyone. He had no alibi. We asked why he'd left Pine Hollow so suddenly the morning after the murders. He said he'd heard about the killings on the local radio news Thursday morning, had realized police would probably want to question him given his conflict with Glenn, and had decided to leave rather than get caught up in a murder investigation when he had nothing to do with it. He admitted that had been a poor decision, that fleeing made him look guilty. but insisted he'd just panicked and made a bad choice. We asked if we could look at his boots. He said sure, showed us the work boots he was wearing, size 12, same brand as those we'd found in his garage in Pine Hollow. But these boots looked new, barely worn. We asked if he owned other boots. He said he'd left an old pair in Pine Hollow when he moved, hadn't thought they were worth taking. Those were the boots we'd already collected from his garage. We asked if he owned a shotgun. He said yes. He had a 12-gauge shotgun he used for hunting, kept it in his truck usually. We asked to see it. He showed us a Remington 870, one of the most common shotguns in America. In good condition, we confiscated it as evidence. Tally agreed to provide fingerprints and voluntarily allowed us to search his current residence. The fingerprints were compared against unidentified prints found at the Miller house. No matches. The search of his Missouri residence found nothing connecting him to the murders. The shotgun was test-fired, and the ballistics compared against evidence from the crime scene. The results were inconclusive. The pellets and wadding were consistent with having been fired from Tally's shotgun, but also consistent with having been fired from thousands of other 12-gauge shotguns. We couldn't definitively say Tally's gun had killed the Millers, but we couldn't rule it out. We had strong circumstantial evidence. Tally had a clear motive: the property dispute, Glenn's threat to file complaints. He had the means, owned a shotgun of the correct type, owned boots that matched prints at the scene. He had no alibi for the time of the murders, and he'd fled Pine Hollow the morning after the killings. But we didn't have physical evidence definitively linking him to the crime. We didn't have witnesses placing him at the Miller house that night. We didn't have his fingerprints at the scene. We didn't have gunshot residue on his clothes. He'd had days to wash any clothes he'd been wearing. We didn't have blood spatter or other biological evidence connecting him to the murders. The Madison County prosecutor reviewed the evidence and concluded we didn't have enough to charge Tally. Everything we had was circumstantial, and a defense attorney would argue that Tally fleeing was explainable by panic, that the boots were common, that the shotgun was common, that having a dispute with someone doesn't make you their killer. The prosecutor said if we could find one piece of physical evidence definitively connecting Tally to the scene, his fingerprints, his DNA, a witness who saw him there, something, we could proceed. But without that, we risked trying him and having him acquitted, which would prevent us from trying him again and again if better evidence emerged later. We continued investigating. We interviewed everyone who'd been in Pine Hollow the night of November 19th, asking if they'd seen Tally's white Ford truck near the Miller property. Nobody had. We checked Tally's financial records, looking for evidence he'd hired someone to commit the murders. We found nothing suspicious. We investigated other potential suspects, other people who'd had conflicts with Glenn Miller, drifters who'd been in the area, anyone who might have had motive and opportunity. We found several people who'd argued with Glenn over various issues, but none who had the kind of motive that would explain murdering the entire family, and none who couldn't account for their whereabouts that night. By 1987, the active investigation had slowed. We'd exhausted our obvious leads. Vincent Tally remained our primary suspect, but without additional evidence, we couldn't charge him. The case remained open as an active homicide investigation, but without new information, there wasn't much to pursue. The Miller family was buried in Pine Hollow, a large funeral attended by most of the town. The farm was eventually sold by Glenn's brother, who inherited it. Nobody wanted to live in the house where 4 people had been murdered. The property changed hands several times over the years. The house eventually torn down, the land used for grazing cattle. Vincent Talley continued living in Missouri, working as a surveyor. We kept tabs on him for years, hoping he'd do something or say something that would connect him to the murders. He never did. He died in 2019 at age 75, taking whatever secrets he had to his grave. I retired from the Arkansas State Police in 2019 after 33 years. The Pine Hollow Massacre remained one of my major unsolved cases. I'm 82 years old now, living in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and I think about the Miller family regularly. Over the 38 years since the murders, I've remained convinced that Vincent Talley killed them. Everything points to him: the motive, the means, the opportunity, the flight from Pine Hollow the morning after. The property dispute had escalated to the point where Glenn was threatening Talley's career and livelihood. Talley, feeling cornered and angry, decided to eliminate the problem permanently. I believe Talley drove to the Miller farm Wednesday evening, knowing the family would be having dinner around that time. He kicked in the front door, walked directly to the kitchen where he could hear them, and opened fire with his shotgun. He killed all four quickly, ensuring no witnesses. He walked through the house to the back door and left via the back porch. The mysterious stopping of the footprints at the edge of the porch has a simple explanation. Talley had parked his truck at the back of the property, walked to the house wearing muddy boots, and after the murders, he removed the boots on the back porch before walking to his truck in socks or different shoes, ensuring he didn't leave a trail that could be followed. He returned to his rental house in Pine Hollow, cleaned his shotgun, washed his clothes, disposed of or hid any evidence. The next morning, hearing the news of the murders on the radio, he panicked and decided to leave town immediately before police could question him. That's what I believe happened, but I can't prove it. Talley is dead, taking his guilt or innocence with him. The physical evidence we collected, the boots, the shotgun, the shell casings, sits in evidence storage, a reminder of a case that was never solved. The four members of the Miller family deserve better. Glenn and Donna should have had more years together, should have seen their children grow up and start families of their own. Travis and Emily were just teenagers. Travis should have graduated high school, gone to college, or learned a trade, had a full life ahead of him. Emily should have had all those same opportunities. Instead, they were murdered during dinner, killed for what I believe was a property dispute that could have been resolved through legal channels. They were killed by someone who decided violence was preferable to negotiation or compromise. I couldn't give them justice. I couldn't prove who killed them. Couldn't bring anyone to trial. Couldn't provide their extended family with the closure that comes from a conviction. That failure has weighed on me for 38 years, but I can remember them. I can tell their story. I can insist that they mattered, that their deaths deserve to be acknowledged, that they're more than just a cold case file. The Pine Hollow Massacre shocked a small Ozark community and left scars that have never fully healed. People in Madison County still talk about it, still remember the Miller family, still wonder if Vincent Talley really did it or if the real killer was someone else who got away with murder. I know what I believe, and I hope that somewhere, somehow, the truth is known and the Miller family has found peace. Glenn, Donna, Travis, and Emily Miller were real people who lived and loved and worked hard on their farm. They deserved to live out their natural lives. They deserved justice, and they deserve to be remembered. That's my promise to them, and I'll keep it for whatever time I have left. You're not forgotten. You never will be. The dinner interrupted on November 19th, 1986, has never been finished. But the memory of four people who sat down to eat that evening lives on, and it will continue to live on until the day truth finally arrives, and justice, however delayed, is finally served. Rest in peace, Miller family. You deserve so much better, but you're not forgotten.